Guys, it's Luke. Welcome to my new series on this channel where we're going to be going over my positional rankings for fantasy football. This video though, we're going to be covering my top 24 QBs for the 2021 season, as well as some of my favorite breakout candidates for fantasy football. We're going to be cycling in this series through all of the positions before the NFL season begins to give my rankings for you guys before you guys draft. The logic is with these rankings is that if you're drafting for a season-long fantasy league, you guys just take a look at my rankings and simply pick the one that is ranked the highest. After we cycle through all the positions, I'm going to be giving my entire fantasy rankings as well, so you can have just one allocated list to pick the highest ranked player if you don't know who to choose. I also want to let you guys know we're going to be using my data-based approach to take this on as always. I use data-based approaches to take on all daily fantasy sports or fantasy sports in general. The PGA Tour, NFL, NBA, UFC, all those different sports, I have an approach that uses data, I uses mathematical modeling to try and simplify my analysis and make it as accurate as humanly possible. So top of the NFL, like I said, I cover all those other sports. So if you're looking for even more data-based analysis, make sure to check out my channel. Without further delay though, let's hop into the stats and figure out who the best plays for the fantasy football this year are at QB. We're kicking off the rankings with our surefire studs, ranks 1 through 6 here. And kicking it off, we have Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. He's going to easily be my favorite QB to target in the 2021 season. I'm targeting him in the 3rd or 4th round of my fantasy drafts. And there's really not a shadow of doubt in this pick, in my opinion. You see a lot of people ranking Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, even guys like Russell Wilson at number 1 this year. And quite frankly, they're just wrong. If we take a look at Josh Allen's stats from last year, he ranked number 3 in passing yards, number 3 in passing touchdowns, but on top of being one of the best passers in the NFL, he was also a very good rushing threat, coming number 4 in rushing TDs, number 5 in rushing yardage. And his advanced metrics were even better. He came in number 1 at completion percentage over expectation. That is a statistic where we try to account for volatility and whether a player was lucky or unlucky last year, and Josh Allen was the most unlucky QB in the NFL. So he's going to go out and likely have positive regression this year in terms of his completion percentage. He was also number 2 in success rate per dropback. So on top of having the number 3 statistic in terms of passing yardage, in terms of passing touchdowns as well, he was also extremely efficient. Only Patrick Mahomes passed Josh Allen in that statistic. So I list all those stats just to show you how well-rounded Josh Allen's game is. He has Emmanuel Sanders coming into the offense to make up for Josh Brown. Also still has Cole Beasley, decent tight end options, and a good O-line as well. So I really like his floor. I think he's definitely going to be one of the top 3 QBs this year. And obviously, given that well-rounded skill set, is very likely to be the number 1 fantasy QB as well. Rounding on number 2, we have Pat Mahomes. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. He is an absolute stud when it comes to arm talent. Arguably the best arm talent in NFL history. My issue in fantasy formats is going way too early. This guy's being drafted in the 2nd or 3rd round of fantasy drafts. And while Patrick Mahomes is extremely safe, you can't go wrong with picking Patty Mahomes. Picking him in the 2nd or 3rd round comes with a ton of opportunity cost. At number 3, we have Kyler Murray. I'm a little bit higher on Murray than most. He had a very strong season number 2 last year. Was the front runner for the MVP through, let's say, 13 or even 14 weeks last year. Got derailed by the shoulder injury, and as a result is coming in under-owned this year. Even though he was the number 1 fantasy QB last year, even though he was absolutely tearing it up, won me my fantasy league, even though he got hurt at the end. He's being under-owned. People are looking into those last 3-4 games, really hurting him, holding it against him with his projections, and he was playing hurt. It was very obvious. He was only throwing the ball 20-30 yards downfield. He had explosive 40-50 yard touchdowns every game, seemingly in the games before that. I look for him to return to form. And Kyler Murray, he's being drafted in the 7th and 8th round right now. I think if you picked him in the 6th or 7th round, sure, you're buying in a little bit early, but you're also getting a guy who's at my number 3 ranked QB for this year at the very least. At number 4, we have Dak Prescott, also somebody who's coming off an injury, somebody who was arguably playing even better than Kyler Murray last year in his first 6 games, averaging over 500 passing yards per game. So obviously that's a ridiculous statistic. That's not going to be repeatable this time around. But it just shows you how well he was clicking with the offense last year. He obviously had the ankle injury, had the shoulder injury this preseason. So he's also somebody who's being drafted a little bit later than I expect to in fantasy formats, and somebody I think is a good value in that stud range. At number 5, we have Lamar Jackson. Not really much to say here. I'm not a big fan of Lamb Jack's game, to be honest with you. I think that defenses are eventually going to catch up to him. We saw it with Robert Griffin III. We've seen him with plenty of scrambling QBs in the past. Lame Jack really has to work on his accuracy. He's somebody who still has above average accuracy, but we've seen plenty of QBs in the past with above average accuracy fail. The running game's not always going to be there. It's always going to be a little bit of an X factor for him. But that's why I have him at number 5. Obviously, he could come out have a very good season. Harbaugh's a very good offensive coordinator in terms of being a head coach. So he comes in number 5. It's a respectable number. I'm just not huge on Lamar Jackson this year. At number 6, though, it's a little bit of a surprise. Aaron Rodgers. Everyone wants to write him off after his diva-like offseason with all the headlines, all the negative attention coming his way. But Aaron Rodgers has been the best quarterback in the NFL for the last 15 years. If we're looking at stats, right? Best QB in terms of performance, obviously Tom Brady. But in terms of statistical performance, Aaron Rodgers is king over the last decade and a half. He's going to have much more influence over the offense this year. He's already brought in Randall Cobb. Already rumors of bringing in Clay Matthews or even some of his former targets as well. So I really like that Aaron Rodgers is going to feel comfortable this year. I don't think he's felt comfortable in the Packers offense in quite some time. And despite that, we've seen him win an MVP. We've seen him put up quite nice numbers. So as a result, I'm going back to Aaron Rodgers. And I also think he's a good value pick, being drafted a little bit below where he should be. And now the next tier, I'm going to call them the value candidates. Every player in this range is being drafted lower than they should be. All these guys have the potential to be at a top 5 QB this season, some more than others. That's why they're ranked the way that they are. Kicking it off, though, is Russell Wilson at number 7. He has one of the best, if not the best, receiver cores in the entire NFL. He's got Tyler Lockett. You got DK Metcalf on the other side. He supports his passing production with his rushing production as well. So just like Lame Jack, just like Josh Allen, just like Kyler Murray, these players have relatively high floors when it comes to fantasy because of that rushing production. Russell Wilson was also in the MVP candidacy last year as well. He was a candidate before Week 13. Weeks 14 through 17 were a little bit rough for Russell Wilson last year. They ended up faltering down the stretch quite a bit. But Russell Wilson's, again, he's a veteran. He's been around forever. He's an established stud when it comes to fantasy football. There's a very good opportunity that he finishes top 5 in the quarterback rankings. And right now he's being drafted as the number 9 QB. So I think there's a lot of value there. Again, he's somebody I'd be willing to even bet for an MVP this year. He's just that good of an offense around him. Obviously, the narrative coming from Pete Carroll right now is that they want to run the ball, and they want to run it some more. I don't buy that. A lot of that is coach speak. Like Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. What happens if the Seahawks go out the first game and get stuffed on their first 5 runs? Pete Carroll's going to start throwing the ball crazy, and if that works, that's going to happen the rest of the year. So I don't buy into that coach speak too much, and that's really why I think Russell Wilson's a good value candidate. At number 8, we have Tom Brady. I'm not going to go crazy on Tom Brady here. He had a great season last year. Statistically, was a top 12 fantasy QB, was a top 8 fantasy QB for most of the year as well. I absolutely love him in 2021. Not only does he have Antonio Brown, who's going to have a full offseason. I think Antonio Brown, by the way, I know we're not talking about wide receivers right now, top 10 fantasy receiver this year. So not only does he have Antonio Brown, he has Mike Evans, also has Chris Godwin. He has the best receiver core in the NFL. I would say it would go probably the Buccaneers, then the Seahawks, and then probably the Pittsburgh Steelers. A little bit of a homer, but we got some good receivers out there. He has the weapons. He has the offensive-minded coach in Bruce Arians to get the job done. He threw the ball 40 to 50 times a game last year. Really nothing to complain about. The only real knock you could have on him is his age, but it's Tom Brady. I mean, the guy's a robot. We've seen him defy time to this point, so why expect that to change? At number 9, we have Matthew Stafford of the Rams. Obviously moved from the Lions to the Rams. He is by far my biggest breakout candidate this year. Somebody I've bet for MVP already. Somebody that gets paired with not only an offensive mastermind in Sean McVay, but easily the best set of weapons he's ever had in his career. Why I absolutely love his yardage production. I loved it out in the Lions. He had a couple 5,500-yard seasons, close to 5,800-yard seasons. He's going to break 6,000 yards this year. I think he could very well challenge the all-time yardage mark for a passing QB. And a lot of that has to do with the scheme he's going to be in over in LA. So before Cam Akers got injured, it was looking like a relatively run-heavy scheme, maybe a little bit more balanced since they had Matthew Stafford now rather than Jared Goff. But now that Cam Akers is sidelined, it is going to be a pass-heavy offense. It's going to be very pass-heavy. We've seen it from Sean McVay in the past when he's had his running backs go down. Unless he trusts his running back to not fumble, unless he trusts them to catch the ball, to hit all their blocks, everything like that, he's not going to run it a ton. So Matthew Stafford, I think he's in for a huge season, could break the yardage record. If he does that, he's probably going to win MVP as well. So I also put in an MVP bet. There's a little bit of a drop off after a number 9, to be quite honest with you. Numbers 10 through 12 could be core QBs this year, but they definitely come with risk. All of these guys have glaring weaknesses or glaring problems, and we'll discuss them. So at number 10, we have Justin Herbert. He's a second-year guy in the NFL. I think that's really all I have to say. He showed a ton of potential last year, was a top 10 fantasy QB as well, which is extremely rare for a fantasy quarterback. But he's a high-risk, high-reward play that could easily pay off. He could easily be a top 5 fantasy QB this year, or it could very well be a bottom 10. So high risk, high reward. I'll definitely be drafting Herbert in quite a few fantasy seasons, though. At number 11, we have Ryan Tannehill. Not only does Tannehill, maybe is he the least flashy QB of everyone in the NFL, he's the most consistent, though. And not only is he the most consistent, now he gets Julio Jones added to the mix. And for me, I think that's going to make all the difference. Before, we really just had A.J. Brown. We had Corey Davis, who's, to be honest, he's mediocre at best. But now that you have Julio Jones on one side, you have, A.J. Brown on the other, you have 2 surefire studs out there. Ryan Tannehill is going to have a lot of passing yards this year. Last year, he averaged just over 250 yards per game, which for a fantasy QB is really not going to get the job done. He did average just over 2.5 touchdowns per game, though, so he made up for it with his touchdown production. But now that he has an extra receiver in Julio Jones, now that his O-line has even more experience in front of them, they didn't lose any of their starters. I expect him to have a huge step up in his production. And finally, at number 12, somebody I hate to have to write about. I absolutely hate the Browns. I'm a Steeler fan at heart. Baker Mayfield. He's a huge risk, in my opinion. I think the Browns are either going to go out and win 14 games this year, go like 14-2, or they're going to win like 5 games. There's no in between. I don't see them having, an okay year by any means. They're either going to really take a step forward, they're going to shut a lot of people out, or they're going to look like the Browns. So it's going to be one or the other. And if they end up being a really good team, Baker Mayfield's going to be leading the charge. He's somebody who's a great leader, somebody who had a few good statistical games last year. He's going to be getting OBJ back, going to have more experience with his rookie receivers. Again, he's a very, very high-risk play, but very high reward as well. I think he has a very large range of outcomes. We saw it with his performances last year. He had a few games with like 350 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, but he also had games with 160 passing yards and 3 interceptions. So a really volatile play, somebody I'd be more willing to draft as a backup. I don't think I'd be, relying on him as my fantasy starter by any means, but I definitely think he has plenty of potential. Now we're truly getting into the backups in range 13 through 18 here. At 13, we have Jalen Hurts. I really liked how he performed in his first preseason game. He showed a lot of presence. He showed a lot of accuracy as well, like we saw in all 4 starts last year. I think Jalen Hurts is somebody who's going to be an above-average quarterback just because of his rushing production. We saw quite a bit of that last year, especially in those last 4 games. But obviously, we haven't seen enough of him to really make a convicted play on him. He's somebody who, just like Baker Mayfield's, a relatively high-risk, high-reward play. Not somebody I'd be willing to start my fantasy lineups with, not somebody I'd be relying on week to week. But if you had him on the bench, had him as a backup, or somebody as a potential, futures pick or something like that, I really like him in that format. At number 14, we have Matt Ryan. Not going to go into much detail here. He doesn't have Julio Jones, but he still has, a solid range of options. He's, Ridley out there. A couple, Pitts, the new receiver. Also Hayden Hurst at tight end. He's always been a solid fantasy quarterback. Always put up plenty of production. That's how I feel about him. Joe Burrow, coming off the injury, I'm a little bit lower on him than most this year. Before the injury, he was all right. He had a few good games with like 300-plus passing yards, some touchdowns here and there, but he also threw a ton of interceptions. His O-line was horrible. It looked like he was running from the other team more than he was passing the ball. If you guys remember the Super Bowl, obviously you guys do, Patrick Mahomes was just running for his life the entire time. That was Joe Burrow the entire season. So obviously he's got a lot of talent. Hell, you guys even saw Patrick Mahomes struggled when he was under that, those type of circumstances. So while I think Joe Burrow is one of the best arm talents in the NFL, he's going to be a top 5 fantasy QB for decades to come, to be quite honest with you. He needs to get the O-line in front of him. Right now it's patchwork. They're all shitty. And he's going to struggle until that happens. At number 16, we have Big Ben. I'm a homer. He's definitely ranked higher than most would have him. It's going to be his last season. He's going to retire after this season. Pretty much tell you guys that right now. Pretty much no matter what happens. And he's a guy who motivates himself. We've seen it before. He'll like fake injuries. He's a diva a little bit. But when he's motivated, he plays well. We've seen it before. For Ben Roethlisberger, that's a legitimate X factor for him, is that motivation. And he has more motivation this year than he's ever had before. Also has one of the best receiver cores in the NFL. I'd probably put him at number 3. Again, maybe that's a little bit higher than most would put him, but Chase Claypool, absolute stud on the outside. Deontay Johnson, probably the best route runner in the NFL behind Antonio Brown. And then obviously you have Juju, right? Harden sold the team, slot receiver, probably top 5 slot receiver in the NFL. So I don't hate his options. I don't hate his motivation this year. Not somebody I'd be drafting as my starter for a fantasy league, but as a backup, I definitely think there's a lot worse options. Number 17, we have Kirk Cousins, Mr. Anti-Vax. I'm not going to go into that too much. He's an okay option, right? He's been decent in fantasy over the years. Horrible quarterback, horrible leader. We'll leave it at that. At number 18, we have Cam Newton, somebody who's a very good rushing threat. I am much higher on Cam Newton this year than essentially everyone else, even Patriots fans, to be quite honest with you. Cam Newton, had a horrible year last year. Had a few bright spots, won them a game or two, but had plenty of down spots. Horrible interceptions, horrible game calling, horrible just awareness, to be quite honest with you. But that comes when you're playing for Bill Belichick. It's a hard offense. There's a lot of complexities to it. It typically takes players a year or two to get used to that type of system. And Cam Newton came in with just a few months of practice, no training camp, and he really did his best. And I'm not going to hold that against him. I can tell you right now that Bill Belichick is not holding that against him. If there's anyone that understands how complex that system is, it's him. Cam Newton right now, I'm not sure if he's going to get the start day one. They may start Mac Jones. Mac Jones has looked really good as well. But if Cam Newton is getting the start, if he's going out there week 1, I really like his options in fantasy. And finally, for our last range here, 19 through 24, these are going to be our fantasy flyers. These are going to be guys that I'm taking chances on here and there. Could potentially even be my 3rd quarterback on my roster if I'm drafting 3. And at number 19, we have Trevor Lawrence, complete wild card here. We've never seen him in action. I saw him the other day in his preseason action, and honestly, he didn't look very sharp. Obviously, we're going off the pedigree that we've seen from Lawrence over the years. Number 1 draft prospect, probably since Andrew Luck. So that's why he's at number 19. Obviously, he's got the pedigree. I just want to see it in person before I'm ranking him higher in my list. At number 20, you have Tua Tagovailoa. Horrible season statistically last year. To be honest, we're buying on his pedigree. We saw it in college. He had some good statistical seasons. He showed that rushing upside as well. Last year was playing with the injured hip. Came back a little bit earlier than most expected him to. So I think a lot of that had to do with why we didn't see the rushing production. They didn't want to risk re-injuring that hip. If he brings that rushing production out this year, he could very easily be a top 12 fantasy QB. At number 21, you have Jared Goff. Poor guy has to go to the Lions. Was a top 15 fantasy QB last year, but now that he's on the Lions, who absolutely suck, honestly, he could be ranked even lower. I probably should have had him at like 24 or 25, to be honest with you, now that we're recording this. At number 22, we have Trey Lance. Trey Lance looked like an absolute stud in his first preseason game. Fortunately, he was playing backups, right? So a lot of people are looking into that, buying Rookie of the Year shares for Trey Lance, drafting him in fantasy leagues in like the 7th, 8th round now, along some of the surefire studs. And that's ridiculous. I mean, Trey Lance, I have him at number 22. Obviously, I think he has good potential. But to say that he's the next Tom Brady after seeing him throw one 80-yard touchdown against backups, I mean, come on, guys. Even Derek Carr goes out and throws 80-yard touchdowns every once in a while. He's trash. So speaking of Derek Carr, he's at number 23, right? So he's a good fantasy QB. He throws lots of 80-yard touchdowns. Unfortunately, he throws 2 or 3 interceptions a game. So not much to say there. He's a fantasy flyer. He's a backup on fantasy. And number 24, this is somebody who, believe it or not, in this range could end up being a good fantasy QB this year. That's Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones has absolute horseshit of teammates around him. No receivers essentially. Does have Saquon Barkley, but aside from that, his team is trash. And that's not even just on the offensive side of the ball. Their defense is absolutely horrible. I took the Giants to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. The problem is Daniel Jones is actually a really good quarterback. We've seen rushing production from him before. He's much more athletic than you'd expect for Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones is also somebody who's much smarter than you'd expect. He makes all the right decisions. He hardly ever throws the ball into double coverage or anything like that. And the reason I have him at 24 and I'm willing to take him as a flyer is if he's as good as I think he is, he could very well carry the Giants to a decent season. If he does so, He's going to be a decent quarterback in terms of fantasy. And you can essentially draft him in the last round of your fantasy league. So there's no opportunity cost here. I'm taking him as my third fantasy QB in a few of my leagues. That's all I've got, guys. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know in the comments who your favorite QB this year is for fantasy football and when you're drafting them. We'd all love to see and would love to get a healthy conversation going down in the comments. As always, make sure to like and subscribe if you guys enjoyed the content. Not only does it help me with growing this channel, it also makes sure that you guys can catch my content as soon as I post it. So that's a win-win right there. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Without further ado, though, good luck with your season-long fantasy lineups, guys. Guys can always leave some questions in the comments if you have any specific questions between players, whether I like a certain guy or not that wasn't ranked. Just let me know. With all that being said, I'll see you guys tomorrow for my fantasy running back rankings.